that all right with everybody, of course? Are you all, anybody who doesn't want to be recorded?
With the usual caveat that if you want to pause or share something particularly personal you don't want recorded, that's fine. I said some things in one of the previous workshops and I thought, oh, that's been recorded. I sort of, you know how you get worried about things? I sometimes get worried in advance, if I get passionate about things. But
I wonder, sorry, carry on.
No, you go.
I just go back to where you left off before we talked about recording, was where to start. And I just wonder, it might be worth you sort of starting with how come, you know, you saw empathy as method, because I think that certainly when I first read your writing, you know, that particular article in 2011, it had a big impact on me, because I come from a person-centered approach, and so the idea of empathy as method was a jarring sensation. So I'm just wondering.
Okay, yeah, I thought that I think that's right. It might be a good place to start, and I also do want to pick up on some of what people have said, so we try and weave that in. So yeah, and I just before I start, I suppose I'm just wanting to register that I'm very touched by a lot of the stories and a lot of what people are putting in, and yeah, I hope we can help to sort of unpack some of that. And the thing that's actually on top for me is because I've also got a background, I sometimes describe myself as speaking two languages, TA and person-centered psychology, and I've written probably as much in person-centered world as I have in the TA world, and in some ways co-creative TA for me is part of reconciling those two worlds and bringing some of the person-centered qualities and images and learning into TA. And I think Graham would say that was true for him with Gestalt. So I sometimes describe co-creative TA as our story, both together and a little bit separately, of how we sort of made our way with TA, to some extent made our peace with TA, because we could have gone somewhere else. So I'm a little bit with Roger's, one of the last papers he wrote in his life, almost looking back, was a paper I think it was 1986 called Empathy, an Unappreciated Way of Being. And given what a lot of you have said in your response there, James, about way of being rather than doing, I think that's what I want to hold, that empathy is the embodiment of a way of being, essentially, I think, particularly from a person-centered perspective. So the reason that I got onto the idea that empathy was a method was, so there's a little bit of a backstory. So Graham and I won't go into all the details, because some of it we've said before and some of it we've written and so on, but essentially we got together, wrote in 1988, 99, wrote co-creative, that first paper that was published in 2000. And that was a rereading of TA and looking at transactions, ego states, scripts and games from this more sort of constructivist, deconstructivist sort of perspective, drawing on intellectual traditions like field theory, social constructivism and so on. So that article was really written as a way of looking at TA from a slightly different perspective. I was by then quite an enthusiastic writer. Graham, by his own admission and recognition, wasn't, and had this sort of sense of falling over after the article was published. We both were, were grateful that the TAJ had published it and so on. And I remember a conversation with Graham where he said, "Oh, I think you should write an article on the integrating adult." So I, because I'm very compliant and obedient, I of course did what I was told. So 3 years later, published the article on the neo-psyche integrating adult in a book edited by Charlotte Sills and Helena Hagedorn. And so that was really developing the, if you like, the sort of the ontological basis. That I do tend to use words like that because I've got a background in philosophies, and I love playing with ideas. So if you like, the first article was a sort of rereading of TA, and then we sort of we were looking at what are the implications for ego states, which in a sense describe personality and describe the essence of things from a TA perspective. And that's where I developed the idea of the integrating adult rather than the integrated adult, and took about 10,000 words to say that, but that was that step. And Graham said, that's great. And then about a year later, he said, I think you should write something about the method, because we're setting all this stuff up. We're saying we're offering a critique, we're offering a rereading of TA. You've then done this thing about the integrating adult, but we actually haven't said, so what does this look like in practice? What's the method? So that led me 2011. This is by now. I also emigrated in the meantime and had a few other things that I was doing. But I started writing the article that then came out on empathy, a co-creative perspective. And halfway through that, I realized that actually TA doesn't say much about empathy. And the person who says the most about empathy in TA before then was and still is Richard Erskine. Although, and he also has a very Rogerian perspective. Although I think we think slightly differently about practice. So in the middle of writing the co-creative article, I realized actually I've got to do some research on what people have said about empathy in TA. So that led to an article that I actually published just before, which was called Understanding Empathy. So it's a little play on Roger's idea about empathic understanding, and I reversed that and said, so this is about understanding empathy in TA. So I did that as a sort of almost an academic record of, well, who says what about empathy? Byrne very little, Erskine a little bit, other people a little bit. And then we start getting into the diagrams about what the empathic transactions look like. So that where we bring in Barbara Clark and Hargaden and Sills. And then I finished the co-creative article. And what I was keen to do was to claim, in a way, to answer Graham and other people's question about saying, well, so what do you do? What does it look like in practice? And what I came up with was hanging it around empathy. And so in the article, I talked about, okay, so what we do, and I had, I think, three methods. And because I'm a bit of a philosopher, I also talked about methodology, which is the philosophy behind the method, which is around relationality and so on, and present-centeredness. But I came down to something I thought relatively simple about the method being, the therapist facilitates the client to expand their neo-psychic functioning and so on. And in that, I also made a distinction. So I shifted things on in terms of that, the diagrams about empathic transactions, which will be maybe, I'll pause in a minute so we can have some discussion about what I've said, but we'll go maybe have a look at the diagrams, because I think the diagram I offer in that article it has made some significant differences between, say, the Hargaden and Sills diagram, the Clark diagram before that. What I also think is interesting, and I want to acknowledge, because as you know, Graham and I are very close and we're very together on this, but we also have some differences. And when we put the book together, which was 2014, one of the things he criticized me for was in saying, overemphasizing, as he saw it, empathy as the meditative TA, and he tends to emphasize play. So I do want to acknowledge that in terms of the method, I don't really care what people do as long as they kind of know what they're doing. So I'm not saying, empathy is the method of co-creative TA. I think that's what I was saying in 2011. And if Graham and I had written the article together, we probably would have ended up talking about empathy and play, which he then did talk about in the book in response to my article, because the book is about those sort of interleaved discussions. So just wanted to present that little bit of background to how we get to method. But I don't see method as equating to doing. It's more like it kind of is, you know, it is the doing, but I think what we're catching already is that it's the being that is the doing.
Yeah.
So it's more important about being empathic than having a particular way of doing empathy.
But if you read your article, it's very unlike any articles you might read from, for example, in the person-centered world, thinking of, you know, articles around resonance and things like that, in terms of what you do. What you do is a way of being which is encapsulated in the principles of co-creative TA and not in being empathic. So however you might define that word empathy.
Right. And is that what you were saying is the radical bit, or is that something else?
No, my radical bit's more about your diagram, actually.
Oh, okay. Well, perhaps we'll pause there and then we can come, because we've still got plenty of time too. Yeah. So I don't know if, I hope that bit of history is at least slightly mildly interesting, or gives a little bit of context to why we get to something, or at least why I got to calling empathy a method. I'm aware in saying that there's a lot of different levels of experience in the rooms. So yeah, I'm open to people, you know, asking questions or commenting really on anything.
Keith, I'd just like to say that was really helpful for me, putting it in context.
Oh, great!
Really made it made it much more accessible to me. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Jenny. Particularly given what you said about language, I appreciate that. Yeah.
I'm just wondering what's going on for you all.
Percolating.
I'm mulling over empathy and play and whether the two are inextricably linked.
Well, Graham's views on that are quite interesting, because it's play, and it's play around contact. Because when you speak to Graham about it, he doesn't like empathy as a word or being empathic, but he seems to want to emphasize the quality of our contact, which is, I think, another way of looking at it.
Yeah, and I guess I'm thinking about empathy as kind of both soothing and disturbance, and whether play is both soothing and disturbance as well.
Yeah.
Well, if you think about play as how we learn to socialize, it is disturbing when you think of watching children in the playground and how they fall out with each other and then learn to come back and learn to engage. So,
my son, when he was about 3, had imaginary friends he used to play with all the time. And then after a few months, I noticed he was only playing with one of the 2 friends. And I asked him what happened to the other friend. And he said, oh, she got hit by a car and died. And slightly psychopathic. but there was something disturbing about his play, and it was a way of him making sense of you know, good and evil in the world, and right and wrong. And
yes,
I think it's both fun and energizing and disturbing if we really play, isn't it? Which is what empathy is as well.
And it's interesting, that point about play and contact, because of course contact is the first of Roger's 6 conditions, that the two people are in psychological contact, at least to a minimal level, or even perceived or subceived level. So all the subsequent conditions, including empathy, rest on that idea of contact. And some people would say that I think, well, I think it was HK that you talked about feeling good that people were checking in, and there was, you felt calmed. There was, to me, there was a sort of sense of, oh, so maybe that's the way that we are being together and bringing people in and being perhaps a bit playful, a little bit hesitant. Maybe some of what I said in my, Mihi, my welcome, is calming and regulating. That's actually about contact. You could equally say that's, well, you could even say that's more about contact than being empathic. It's about connecting to the land, it's connecting to ancestors, it's connecting to mountain, to river, to situation, to context. And that's some, that's an important way of connecting before we get to be empathic or not with each other. But it's also edgy, because I know part of my history with contact is that I'm the youngest of three sons. I'm two older brothers, and my older brother who was 6 years older than me, used to play, but like rough and tumble. But he was pretty rough. And so I sort of got used to the rough and tumble that sometimes got hurt, and I think sometimes it sort of verged a little bit on being overly rough. But there was a sort of sense in which I grew up with that rough and tumble, and I think you see it if you see me and Graham together. There's very much a sort of like a rough and tumble kind of energy between us, but that can also be a bit frightening and a bit edgy. Yeah. So I picking up what you're saying, Rachel, I think that's right.
When I, a long time ago, first learned about TA, I was told it was a theory of communication, and that that transactions were another way of talking about that basic way of how we meet each other, how we talk to each other, how we listen to each other, that it was a theory of communication. And presumably that leads on to a kind of awareness of, well, what's happening as we communicate with each other, or try to as we talk, as we listen.
Yeah. And I think in co-creative TA, we tend to think of, what facilitates that capacity to be in contact with each other. And there's something there about the principles of TA engendering, a non-defensive contact where we can be present and play and be socially engaged with each other. And going back to the contact, I think the contact's really important in terms of, how do we make contact with each other, depending on the fact that, we are all very different. And when we think of sort of neurodiversity, what does contact look like for all of us as human beings? And some of us are going to be quite different from each other.
Yeah, I'm really struck by that, because with my son, I now have learned, he's 24 now, but he was not diagnosed till he was 19, but there's a state that he's in where silence is contact, and he certainly can't be touched. So that contact is just being present, and he wants someone to be there, but he does not want to look at them, but he wants presence. Just is enough. And it obviously nourishes him, because he then will move out of that state of, he talks about, I know it's quite a common thing about having spoons. My daughter does too. They wake up with 5 spoons, and things cost them a spoon. So it's some people give them back spoons, and other people drain them of their spoons.
Oh, wow.
So they know that contact is really different depending on the person, the energy. They don't really know how to kind of talk about that, but I really relate to that.
And I think here, we're also now talking about cross-cultural communication. If we're talking about diversity and difference, then I think it's helpful to think about that as cross-cultural communication. My own example from working with a student with ADHD who's writing a dissertation about ADHD, and she struggles with writing to a sort of academic, to the traditional way of academic work and so on. And she sent me some writing, and I edited it sort of to suggest that this is like the standard. And then we got into a really interesting conversation about that whole process. She said, you know, the piece that I sent you, I'd already edited it at least 3 times. And then you edited it again. And then because of the way you did it, I felt, you know, quite upset. I mean, she was saying, I know why you did it, and she appreciated it, but at the same time, it sent her into a bit of a spiral about her, you know, languaging and so on. Mm. So what we came up with, and I said, oh, that's really interesting. And so you've got your draft, which is actually your 3rd draft. Then you've got my comments, and then you've got what you might end up with. So how about putting all 3 pieces in the dissertation and then commenting on that process? And she just went, wow, you know, we were both, because this suggestion came out of the conversation. So we both, and I think she's sort of going, you know, oh, is that allowed? You know, and here I am, professor of psychotherapy and so on. And I'm partly looking over my shoulder and thinking, oh, I wonder if this is allowed. But, you know, we're going to do it anyway. And then she's come up with these beautiful, like sort of visuals about this whole journey. It's completely fascinating. And I think, you know, and I look at it and think, it's like, you know, this is cross-cultural. It was, you know, we might use different languages. It's cross-diversity or whatever. But I think that, and really, you know, that really wanting to understand, be alongside her in her language, and at the same time dealing with the context of her being marked in a way in a different language. Mm. So I think if we can, yeah, maybe we should, this is a workshop about contact and empathy, and the co-creativity, the playfulness that comes in those suggestions and so on. Mm. But I think she hasn't written it yet, but I think it's going to be a fantastic dissertation.
Yeah. It sort of reminds me of those people who embody their research in drama and present their research dramatically, which is a completely different way. And their comment is, so much is lost when we put it into words, and you need to see the embodiment of it.
Yeah. And I suppose it's something to me, and this is about, maybe it's almost a political perspective, certainly philosophical, possibly political, about equality, about seeing those as equal. I worked with a dance therapist who was also writing, and she wrote an article, and it was really difficult, very painful for both of us. And eventually she got there and published. And she said, I think she said, oh, I'll take you out for a tea. Thank you, you know, cup of tea. So she said, and we had the journal article there, and she said, thank you, I really appreciate you helping me to write. She leant across the cafe table. She said, now I'll teach you how to dance. It was wonderful. And it's interesting, if you're open to that, I've got another student who is into sparring. He does exercise, and he's written about psychotherapy and exercise and fusing those. He's probably going to set up the first clinic where he does exercise with clients and psychotherapy, which normally, you know, been very split. And he and I, again, I helped him write and use the boxing metaphor and so on. And then when we published that, we started sparring together in the local park before COVID. And, again, that was great. And we're going to do more of that, walking the talk, literally. So maybe I'm talking about telling these stories about being, you know, it's being open to, for want of a better phrase, this sort of cross-cultural communication and working out how that works. And of course we don't have the answers, and we can't predict what the answer looks like.
What strikes me, Keith, is the element of play in those examples you gave us.
Yes, yeah. Yes, as I was talking, I was thinking I'm being quite playful Who knows? Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe Graham's right.
How much empathy you need when you're fighting, like in fighting, you need empathy in the fighting, and you need empathy in the dance as well. And so it's kind of
So it is both, isn't it? It's being up for the contact and finding a way to be in contact through empathy and play.
So I do 5 rhythms dancing, and that's like all in silence. And so there's loads of empathy in that, because you're having to use your body to say yes or no if you want to dance with somebody or not with somebody. And so, you know, there's individual dancing, and you can dance in pairs or groups as well. And that can be quite confrontational as well, and can be quite, you know, aggressive in the dance sometimes, or less so, and can almost be like a bit of a fighting dance as well. So it's that came up for me. There's an element of play to it too, and
And there's something deeply exploratory about allowing the other to be who they are in however that is, in whatever they bring.
I once went to a snooker club with a client. It was his love, snooker. And so I went and had an experience of what it was like for him to be in that environment. That was some time ago.
Yeah. And that shows a willingness to be open, doesn't it? I mean, and you may, you know, when you say it's some time ago, you may be more cautious about doing that these days with maybe, I don't know, if there's a sort of sense of being slightly more defensive, but that's it's very liberating, isn't it? The fact that you're open to doing that.
When you were talking, Keith, you passed over quite quickly the philosophy that lies behind your approach. And of course, you know, empathy as method. No, you're actually picking up on something quite philosophical, as the method is the end point of beginning with thinking about, you know, what are you dealing with as a reality, and how you then work with it. And therefore, I think your ideas, that box you've got in your paper, which starts with ontology, a way of being, and then goes through the ideas of human nature, and then epistemology, what do we class as knowledge, and then methodology, how do we think about going about something. And I think it is really important, because it's what lies behind what we've been talking about in the terms of working with diversity and working with difference and working with whatever people bring. And it is that move, that focus on the other, and then the focus into the relationship. Whereas I think TA, in a very traditional way, can actually look as if it's coming from quite a scientific method. We say TA is a humanistic approach, but whenever I ask a group of trainees, I give them the ideas of various modalities and then say, where would you place TA? It's never comfortably within the humanistic approach. And I think the philosophical ideas, the importance of subjective experience, the importance of what's going on between us as people is really significant, and empathy seems to be really relevant to that. That empathic contact, which can facilitate, you know, what we call the intersubjective space.
Yeah, it's interesting that the point you raised about philosophy, because I think, and we've had, Rachel, you and I've had a brief conversation about this. I think TA has been a bit philosophy light, and you know, if you actually dig around, you know, it seems fairly traditional. So, well, it's kind of humanistic, but you know, it certainly has its root in psychoanalysis. Early TA, classical, was quite cognitive behavioural. There's arguments to say, I think Ian Stewart makes the argument that it probably goes across all three forces of psychology, you know, which are seen to be sort of psychoanalytic. behaviorist and humanistic. If you read Byrne, he talks about, he obviously draws on phenomenology and existentialism. He never talks about humanism, never talked about humanism, because it was almost pre, if you think he was writing in the late 40s and humanistic psychology was being consolidated in the early 60s. So I think it's a bit up for grabs, and that, you know, people like Rachel and others might do a bit more digging around and you know, looking at that. But certainly I've been keen in my writing to sort of put where I'm coming from in that respect. And I agree, and maybe it's worth just saying a bit about the methodology and the method then, in terms of that paper, because what I tried to do was to say, in terms of perhaps nuancing some of the original principles, you know, what I said was that the methodology is based on partnership. So the therapist is working in partnership with the client. So there's a real sense of partnership. And by then I was living here, and I was very influenced by the idea of partnership between Tangata Whenua, which means people of the land, and Tangata whatever else means, you know, Tangata Te Tiriti, I'm a person of the Treaty of Waitangi, or I'm Tauiwi, I'm new bones in this land. However you position yourself, you are positioning yourself in some relationship of partnership. So that's what in a way, in terms of methodology, I was talking about partnership. I also talked about what was present, working in the present, which is obviously related to the co-creative principle of present-centered development. And also working with the neo-psychic integrating adult, this idea of a constantly updated and updating aspect of our psyche. You know, Alistair, you were saying, oh, I'm, you know, semi-retired, but I'm learning, and I'm interested in this, and I'm interested in that. And that, you know, reminds me of, again, Roger's paper. He wrote a lovely paper called Growing Old or Older and Growing, query. I'm definitely on the side of older and growing. So that idea that we're constantly we have that capacity to constantly update. So those are sort of almost the philosophical positionings that I was proposing in terms of the method. And in a way, and I don't, again, this might speak to the radicalism, is I think however we do that, if we have a sort of a philosophical underpinning, you know, then do what I'd say, we do whatever we need, we do whatever we do in order to get there. And whether that's, you know, with a particular focus on empathy, or a particular focus on contact, or a particular focus on play or music, or engaging with a client's life by going to their snooker club or attending their wedding, or, you know, I mean, I'm not saying these are easy things, and they're complex to think about in terms of boundaries and ethics and so on. But it's a bit like, if that's what we're trying to help with, then it almost, the method doesn't matter. I proposed some method, but the method, as long as the method is sort of philosophically congruent with your philosophy and your client's philosophy, then I think maybe that's the more important thing than saying this is how to do it.
Yeah, and I think that actually, you know, in terms of thinking of working in TA, it gives you a guide to how you're going to be, doesn't it? Your values actually inform, because provided what you do, your method, is consonant with that, that's okay. And I think there's one thing you've left out there, which is part of the radicalism, which is a shift from the focus on what the therapist does to what the client's doing.
Yeah. And that's, well, you speak to that.
I'll speak to that.
Because I'm going to listen.
I think if you read, you know, when I started in my person-centered training, the focus was very much on very practical, and the focus was very much on what the client, you know, what the client brings, what's going on for the client, and an exploration of that. So philosophically, it was very much about, this is about exploring the client's process and valuing the client's process as being the most important aspect. And what you do is a way of being with that. And there's, you know, one of Roger's books is called A Way of Being. Coming into TA, when you read a lot of TA, perhaps more so with the earlier TA, there's a lot about what the therapist does. And that really bridled for me in learning TA, because, and going back to, I forget who it was, one of you in your introduction was talking about trying to think about all the stuff it was you, Amanda? Thinking about all the theory and how you're going to use that. And actually, I don't do that. My focus is being with my client, being in the intersubjective space and wondering what's happening in the here and now. And actually, I don't have time to organize my thoughts around personality adaptations or what the discount matrix might look like. My brain doesn't function like that. So I won't engage with that. But there is a fundamental shift, I think, in co-creative TA, which moves away from what the therapist is doing. And the therapist, there are important things for the therapist, but the focus is on what the client is doing, because the philosophy here is an organismic philosophy behind the fact that we grow, we heal, we develop through our evolution, through our biology, through our way of being socially. And that's what cures. So it also involves a very, very fundamental different way of thinking about cure, that it isn't about the therapist doing something that decontaminates or deconfuses. If you're then working with, a different ego state structure, because ego state structure and co-creative TA is fundamentally different. So it is getting hold of that sense of the focus then goes on, well, what is the client up to? And of course, co-creative TA, it is about the intersubjective space. And another part of the focus is, what am I up to as the therapist and what's going on between us? But it just moves away from what does a therapist do? And the other aspect of the radicalness, and I've sort of not been in contact with much recent writing in person-centered, and Keith probably is more in contact with it. But I think from what I've learned about person-centered work, the role of empathy is very important. And what comes up, and perhaps we'll look at Keith's diagram, is the client self-adults, self-deconfuses, self-decontaminates by them learning to empathize with themselves through their contact with the therapist. And it's that learning to empathize with yourself that is, I think that's fun. I think that's radical from a person-centered approach, and I think it's radical from a TA approach. And that's what I mean, Keith, about how I see it as being radical, because it's about relying on the client in the right environment, being able to begin to reconnect with old archaic material and to process it. And Keith talks about this is what's called integrating. And it's that process of recontacting the stuff you don't want to look at, the stuff that you've pushed out of awareness. So that stuff in the archaeopsych and the exterior psyche. So
thank you.
Yeah, so that's my sense of it. And I wonder what that brings up for you in terms of your work, maybe just beginning in your training and maybe meeting quite a lot of classical TA, as quite a few of our trainings seem to stress. That might give you something that's quite conflictual with what your current learning is.
I am quite new to this, which is probably what comes out of what I'm saying. But I've connected a little while ago with the present-centeredness again, the felt sense, and I think that ties in quite nicely with empathy, because as I said before, if I'm not being, if I'm not feeling, if I'm not present centered in that moment, how can I be empathic? You know, how can I feel? How can I be? I can't do the doing, and I don't want to do the doing because that's too, you know, that's in my head. So I suppose if I'm relating it to my work situation, which I'm finding quite challenging. See, on another level, if I don't experience this and get through it with the right tools of, I suppose, being in it, I'm never going to come out the other end to be stronger and better and more, what can I say, developed. So I'm trying to do it, if it makes sense, in a co-creative way. This is not a normal thing to do. I'm working in a school. I suppose that's I'm in currently. I was just very tempted to leave because I was getting quite cross. But that's because I was doing rather than being, experiencing. And as Keith was saying earlier about being in contact and connecting. And I've struggled with that, although I thought, gosh, I'm so approachable, I'm so this and I'm so that. And now I'm thinking I'm so not, because clearly I need to get through to these people. What am I doing wrong? Where do I need to begin? And how is it for me? So, you know, as you said, James, back on me, you know, connecting with the old stuff, being empathic with myself first. Again, it's a bit like the one in belonging, you know. Where do I belong? How, you know, how do I see empathy for myself? What can I do for me first?
Yeah, and that
it's very experiential.
and it involves you staying with your vulnerability rather than defending against it.
Yeah.
And sadly, you may or may not be able to change your work fellows.
No.
You can be all that you are.
Oh, thank you.
I also have a response to you, HK, but I also want to acknowledge Rachel's chat about a break. And my apologies. I think because I've done 2 hour sessions, we just took on straight through. Of course, this is 2.5 hours. So I thank you for raising that, Rachel. And I think it probably is a good time to take a break in terms of a comfort break. Would that be acceptable? Yeah. I'd suggest 10 minutes because that's a round number. We reconvene at 1/2 the hour, 1/2 whatever it is for you, and 9:30 for me.
Yeah.
And Keith, if you could come back to me, I'd really appreciate it.
I won't forget. I've got something in mind to say.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay. See you in 10 minutes.
See you in 10 minutes.
We'll leave it open, but
Yeah.
Just close mic.
Yeah, I'll switch the recording off. Can you help me remember as well to?
We thought we'd also speak to the diagram, partly because we were going to, and partly because Amy's asked me to. So so HK, the bit I was wanting to pick up was you at one point in what you said, you talked about I'm not going to do that because that's head stuff. It was like you equated doing with head as distinct from being. Yeah. And there's something I think about it, almost a false, the danger of a false polarity about that somehow that doing becomes equated with the head and somehow being with the heart, and it's all about being. But I think we can think and do and be all at the same time. So I suppose that I just wanted to offer that more, perhaps a slightly different, maybe integrating, joined up thinking. I agree with what you said about when I'm with the client, I'm often not thinking about theory. Dave Means puts it beautifully. He's a great person-centered theorist, and he said, theory gets you to the door, but when you're actually working with a client, it's more about you know, intuition and being and, you know, whatever. But I'm don't want to throw out thinking or doing, because I think often we express our way of being and philosophy through doing, and we think, and we can think about it, and of course we need to be able to think about it. I mean, for those of you who are still, you know, going to write your CTAs, you have to present your thinking about your doing, even if that's a way of being. So I just wanted to offer that back rather than make a sort of like a false polarity about it. Does that make sense? You're on mute.
Yeah.
It does make sense, and it's what I'm hearing is permission as well in all those 3 categories, because it felt quite hard just being, because and then the word integrated comes up again, so maybe that is back to my where it's at for me, the integrating adult, looking at that, being vulnerable with it. So I think I've come to a good place, but that doesn't mean it's easy. So,
No, sure.
So I just want to acknowledge, there's so much to, you know, to take in. But, as I started right at the beginning, calm, and, you know, nurturing and understanding. Maybe that just goes for me first, you know. Let me just be calm and nurturing and empathic for myself first.
Yeah.
And that's why I'm here. So thank you. Thank you to everyone so far. But I'm going to leave it there. Thank you. So we can look at the diagram.
Okay.
Thank you.
So let's just do a quick gauge about interest in breakout rooms, because that might that'll obviously affect how we time things. Would people appreciate time in a breakout room, or do you want to stay as the whole group?
I like staying as a group to hear everybody's thinking. It's helpful.
Me too, yeah. I like being in the big group. Yeah.
I don't mind staying in a big group.
Okay, sounds like a straw poll.
Any bigger than 15 and go into breakout rooms, but 15 this seems like quite a nice manageable number.
Okay.
For everyone to be heard in my
I'm just going to take 30 seconds to plug in, which I would have done in the breakout room. But those of you who have seen me before, I'm in an unfamiliar setting, so I normally have my computer on charger. I'm staying with friends, so I'm in a different setting. So I think there was some idea about wanting to look at the diagram, about the empathy diagram, about how that differs, and I suppose I want to acknowledge what I thought you said before the break, James, was a very I thought it was very good explanation and explication about the sort of client-centeredness that behind that diagram. And maybe it's interesting you talk about it being radical. Maybe it is, but I suppose from a person-centered perspective, I don't see it as so radical. But maybe from a TA perspective, which has perhaps privileged the skills of the therapist over the what happens with the client traditionally, then maybe it is more radical.
But I think there's also, even in the person-centered approach, your focus on empathy needs to be received. There needs to be contact, and empathy is fantastic, but if it's not received, or if it's defensive, it's problematic, which it can be, I think. So, and I think, so that's, so I think even within a person-centered approach, it's radical.
That's true. Yes, and I was just writing about that today for a presentation at the person-centered conference, and people in the person-centered approach still talk about the core conditions and delivering the core conditions, and it just bugs the hell out of me, because Rogers did sometimes use that language, but that was sort of early Rogers rather than later Rogers.
That's
So
right.
to me, more about sort of that co-creative weave. Okay, so can you pull up the diagram, or should we just?
I will share screen. Okay.
Should we do it as sort of like a Zen way? Do talk about a diagram without the diagram?
Well, I think it might be useful to have it up because
It
it
might be
is
useful,
actually
yeah.
a complicated diagram.
It is, yeah. Okay, so there's
oh, whoops! Now I need to reorganize my screen.
no, that's good. That's a good start.
Is
That's
it?
good
Okay,
have.
I'll start there.
Well,
okay.
So we
Yell when you want something different.
Can you make it a bit bigger?
Well, that's what I was going to do.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
Although I have to get, I'm going to stop the share and get to it, and then change it and come back.
Yeah.
Let's just reorganize my screen.
I have to say, when I did my diagram, I thought, "God, this is getting a bit complicated."
You don't say.
So it does look complicated when you see it in the sort of final version, but if you build it up in layers, it doesn't look quite so complicated.
Okay, let's do that. Let's do that.
Maybe it doesn't matter so much about the size of it.
Don't worry. I will get there in a second. Zoom in. Yeah.
Oh, while you are, go on. I was doing a little filler.
I'm there.
Well,
so let's go.
So this was one of the reasons I was interested in the diagram stuff, is because of the visual learning. Could you just put it across? Put the Hagen and Sills. Oh, okay. I see what you're doing. You got both.
Yeah, I've got several open at the same time.
Could we just have the Hagen and Sills first, and then quick? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let's.
I just think it's easier to see that as a visual, because otherwise, even I think it looks too complicated.
Yeah.
So I was keen to look when I was doing these two articles on empathy, and particularly the historical one, and actually finding almost no diagrams about empathy, which is a bit odd because of Burns' thing about bring a piece of theory and a diagram. This is what he said to the people who attended the social psychiatry seminars, and I really value that about him, because in some ways he was quite a conservative guy, but I like the idea that he was whether he thought about this in terms of educational method, I don't know, but maybe just like diagrams. But some of us are more visual learners, and so I think it was appealing to both the perhaps the more academic, the written learners, and then as well as visual. So sorry, I was hoping we'd get Hagen and Sills first.
Oh, sorry, beg your pardon. Oh, okay. Right.
So I did find three articles. I found two diagrams. There was an early diagram by somebody called Barbara Clark, who talked about the reparative relationship, and she did a very basic diagram of empathy, which starts with the therapist on the left-hand side and the client, so that the empathy comes from the therapist, which I thought was interesting, and it is consistent with her idea about the developmentally needed relationship. And by the way, Patricia Clarkson's 5 relationship model partly comes from that Clark diagram.
Sorry, it's not one.
You had it up earlier. I don't know.
I know, but I've moved it around. Oh.
There we go. Okay.
There we go.
So Clark's was the first diagram. This is the second diagram. So this is from Hagen and Sills 2002. And they put the client on the left-hand side, which I like, because that sort of indicates that the client leads, if you read left to right, as we tend to in English. And the therapist on the right, and the initial transaction coming from the client. So that the adult-to-adult transaction and the therapist responding adult to adult. But the Hagen and Sills also say that the empathic transaction is not only the social level, but it's at the psychological level. And the way they diagram it is from the adult of the therapist to the child ego state of the client. And that's essentially because they have a different, they have a particular model of the development of the self, which is in the child ego state. So there's two things about this that are significant and that I differ in my diagram. One is that one is a disagreement about the origin of the self, so they have it located in the child, but at least this is consistent. I'm just pointing out that there's different ways of understanding this. But the more significant difference is that they are saying that as the therapist, you are in some ways deliberately sending an empathic transaction to the client's child ego state. So that's a strategy that they're as they're sort of saying something empathic, that they're holding in mind the child. They're, in a sense, sending an ulterior message to the child. Does that make sense in terms of that? That's what that diagram represents. Okay. Now, if we can move to mine. So, what in my view, what I'm trying to do, and the only thing I'm trying to do, is to work with the integrating adult. I sometimes describe it like, I'm not that clever. I don't know what permission the person needs, so I can't give a permission, even if I thought that was a good idea, which I don't. So what happens to me is how I think about this is the first thing that happened. That's why I labeled them with different numbers. Is that the client says something to which I respond as empathically as possible in the here and now to their integrating adult. Then I think what happens. So no ulterior message, certainly no intentional ulterior, no formulated ulterior message. What I think happens is that if I'm empathic and we're working in the here and now, expanding adult, then exactly what James you described, the client then does their own work. That self-empathy, that appreciation for themselves, that sense of I feel understood. It's going. In making a cross-reference to person-centered, it's exactly that sixth condition, that the client experiences the therapist's positive regard and empathy, and as a result of that, they work through or resolve some archaic material. So they go, oh God, that's so different, and I feel my heart, I can breathe more easily, or whatever it is. But the client's doing the work. And making sense, in other words, taking the empathy in and doing something with that, which we can, in a rather fancy, complicated way, describe as that sort of intersubjective repair. And I diagram that as sort of, if you like, the person going down into some aspect of their child ego state and repairing something, as it were. That is the process of integration. And elsewhere in another article, I did this for the parent, because I didn't want to complicate this diagram. This was complicated enough. And so you could almost say, well, you could do the equivalent in resolving an introjection. So if you feel received enough, if you feel loved enough, empathic, understood enough, the client, I, the client, does that little bit of integration, and then that leads to more being integrated in adult and having less archaic child, because from a co-creative position, you're trying to basically get rid of the undigested archaic child material and the interjected parent material. So that's why I describe that as a sort of going down and a coming up, or you could say going up and coming down if you're talking about it in the parent ego state. Now, in discussing this, and not least with Helena and Charlotte, who are good mates as well as colleagues, they said, well, what do you think might be happening between the client's child ego state and you? And so I came up with this idea of this sort of fifth point, and I think I'd said the client may experience the therapist's empathy also at an ulterior level. So the closest I get to them would be almost the sense of, I think somebody said it earlier today, oh, I'm taking a permission from that. It's almost like they may say it's as if you've given me permission, but it isn't because I haven't. And so I sort of represent that almost like a sort of slightly transferential bounce, like, you know, the client may go like that. And so I describe that as going between child and adult, but in a sort of loop. But that's a projection. It's not something that's coming explicitly or implicitly in terms of I know what I'm doing implicitly from me. And the final thing to say about this, of course, this is also going on for the therapist, that as I expand, as I make a connection, as the client changes me, I may also be resolving some aspects of myself. And again, the same is true. You could see this diagrammed into the child or into the parent. So I'm affected. This is the sort of what person-centered people talk about, you know, mutuality. I'm not, as a therapist, I'm not there to get my own therapy, but I do grow from therapy. I learn from, like you said, Rachel, earlier, you know, as trainers, when we attend workshops, we learn, you know, we're always learning. It's not like there's a fixed position when we're, you know, TSTAs or whatever. So there is a sense in which that's going on for us as well. And that's the, you know, the intersubjectivity within us and between us. So I appreciate it's a bit layered. Looks a bit complex, but it's a bit layered. But it seemed important at the time to sort of say, from this perspective, again, based on a different model of ego states, this is what I think is going on. And I think you're right, James, and I appreciate you sort of highlighting it. You know, in a sense, it is radically client-centered, because it's saying the client's doing that inner work. It's not me pulling or pushing buttons, pulling strings, whatever.
Yeah, and I think that is radically different way of thinking about working with the client.
Yeah.
And it's also radical for the therapist, because it's accepting that you as therapists are going to be changed by this experience.
Yeah.
And therefore there is that mutuality in it. And I think it opens up co-creative TA into that area that you refer to, which is relational empathy, which is that case where we can begin, you know, where this is going on within a group, we can then start to share the minds of other people in the group, because we're willing to be present to each other. And we're not defending against other ways of being, other ways of looking at things.
Or if we are, you know, we may feel like defensive or anxious or whatever, that's also part of what we're dealing with.
Yes, and of course, we haven't really talked about, you know, that aspect of this. We've talked about as if the empathy is always there and it works. But of course, the work is when it doesn't, and what we do to repair and get back.
Yeah.
Can I
go for it, Kath.
Okay, I never know when to speak. Sorry, I'm just thinking. Tell me if I'm off the wall, or just tell me. But in my work with my clients who are autistic with ADHD, one of the biggest pieces of work I have to do at the beginning is I'm working with people who sort of have alexithymia, where they don't recognize their emotions. So I'm feeling them. So I'm working with them and noticing anxiety. And so the step before this is actually helping the people I'm working with to start to recognize their emotions before this can even happen. So I think there's a step back here, and it is working very relationally, but it's also empathic, because I'm feeling it and saying, actually, I'm sensing anxiety there. And the client might say, no, I never feel anxious. And then a few weeks later, they're saying, I'm realizing I'm anxious lots of the time, you know, so there's that sort of thing. I don't know if that helps this, but I feel like, is it even a step before you get to this, really, to be able to connect with that child?
Well, you see, I think if anxiety is in the present, because this is a very present-centered model. So if somebody's feeling anxious in in the present and it's appropriate to the here and now, for me, that's adult. It's not child. So I think I'm not wanting to force that, what you've just said there, Kathy, into this model, but I could see that what you're saying absolutely is a good example of you using your sensitivity and empathy, integrating adult to integrating adult, offering it to the client, saying, I'm sensing some anxiety and I know enough. And this is where the thinking comes in. I know enough about how you might be thinking to say that might be useful to put it in there. For some other clients it may not be. You put it in there, and then this process, this going down into the child and up into the parent, might take weeks. It might come back 3 weeks later, as you say, and say, oh, yeah, I was feeling anxious. Great. To me, that's all integrating adult, and then the work that they're doing over the 3 weeks is the self-therapy. So I think that your example fits this model.
Yeah,
but it
I
only
actually agree.
fits. It only fits if you see anxiety. Well, not only fits, but in addition, yes, anxiety can be child, can be parent, but it can also be integrating adult.
Yeah, and I mean the other factor as well is it's something I've had to learn as a neurodivergent woman, is just I didn't recognize anger for a very, very long time. So noticing that, and I think that's something we can discount because very easily.
Yeah.
Can we get rid of the diagram just so we come back as a group?
Yeah.
I don't know if you noticed earlier, I used the word neurodivergency when I was thinking I don't think I've heard that before. I think I got the word wrong. But I just thought, this is actually, we might be onto something here about Pearl's Gestaltists talk about the safe emergency of therapy, that therapy needs to be safe enough for things to emerge. But there's also a bit of an edginess to that, like it's got to be slightly edgy, it's a bit, it's not going to be so cozy. So I like this concept of safe emergency, and I'm wondering about safe divergency. Is this therapy safe for divergency?
Yes.
And so I just wanted to offer that. It was a slip of the tongue that might make some sense.
I sort of just want to add a thought here. That is something I've realised recently, because I'm very early on working as a therapist. It's only been a few months, and I see my role very much as it's a bit like having the frame of a canvas, the wooden frame of a canvas. So I provide that wooden frame, and then it enables the client to put their canvas over and start looking at themselves. But I have to have that very, very sort of safe place for them, and also to verbalize that, because it can't just be with neurodivergent people, it can't just be assumed. I'm not talking about this is the boundary, that's the boundary, but actually helping verbalizing things for them to hook their thoughts onto. I don't know if I explained it very well, but
yeah, absolutely. I'm noticing a couple of times you've apologized. You've said something really clear and then sort of apologized, or you apologize first, and I wonder if that's part of a hesitancy, almost trying to find a way of, is this a safe divergency here, or can I, like, how do I, doing that dance thing that we were talking about earlier?
And it does make sense, and I'm just going to apologise again, but I'm not going to apologise. I think I was only diagnosed as autistic just over 2 years ago. I'm 58. It's been a massive thing, and I'm having to undo a lot of apologising for being me and learning to be me. So I think that's why.
Wow.
Right. I wonder. Which brings me on to another point. I don't know, can I throw in just another point before, and then it was going back to something that Karen, you said in your introduction, and about how we are co-creatively, and it reminded me of a quote that I love, and I actually used it as the basis of a whole article from Malcolm Parlett, which we quoted in the original 2000 article. He's a Manchester-based Gestaltist. I'm pretty sure he's retired by now, but he and his partner set up the Manchester Gestalt Centre, where Graham worked for many years. And he says this, and I'll read it a couple of times. He says, when two people converse or engage with one another in some way, something comes into existence which is a product of neither of them exclusively. And then this is the real clincher for me. There is a shared field, a common communicative home, which is mutually constructed. So I'll just read that last bit. There is a shared field, Gestalt field theory, a common communicative home, which is mutually constructed. And what I love about that is that sort of sense of, okay, so I am with this client, I am co-constructing a language. And this partly appeals to the thing about this being complicated language, and let's deconstruct it. I think that was Jenny's challenge. So I have to find a language with this client, and it's different from the next client and the next client. And that's again where the divergency and the cross-cultural communication comes in. And it's a bit like, I think it was Jung said, every client deserves a new theory. It's a bit like, well, that's the same. It's like every client deserves this new mutually constructed common communicative home where we create the story, we have the narrative, we have the metaphors and so on. Leonard Campos in TA talks about cure is finding the right metaphor. And I think that's great. So we might have this metaphor running with this client and that metaphor running with that client. And that's the uniqueness. And that to me is the co-creativity. And
that really resonates. Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And that thing about, yes, which metaphor, which client is just... Yeah, and I've noticed with a client that I ended with yesterday, who I found really, really challenging, and almost all the way through our sessions, kind of thinking, well, he's going to go. I always felt on the back foot. I'm probably not quite enough for him. I'm not quite what he needed, despite contracting. And I've got a bit of a thing with TA language at times around things like contracting and treatment planning, which I feel sometimes as a trainee put me off. And I think I connected with it very easily, but coming from a kind of medical background. So I was drawn to that. I was like, oh, magic, something I know about. But actually, I don't want to do that. I'm trying to unlearn it. So it was quite distracting. But with this client, I felt, oh, he's looking for me to give something. But what you were discussing there with your diagram there, Keith, was just so fascinating. That kind of speaking to him on that adult level. And in our ending session yesterday, I said, you know, what do you need here? What do you need for this to be a good ending today? What do you need from me? What do we need to do? And just wanted to reflect, he said, on the progress that he'd made. He's very keen on progress. And he said, I am thinking differently, but I just don't know how I'm doing it. So something's happened. So there is an awareness, and he's very, very defensive about going any deeper than what he can understand and articulate now. So there's so much going on, obviously, and I've tried at times to try and kind of connect with his child and see what he can come up and communicate with about that, but defends against that very strongly. But what he was suggesting, I think yesterday, is what I was seeing in your diagram there, in the here and now, he could notice this was happening, but the work he's doing somewhere which he can't articulate or quite understand was definitely going on underneath. But that use of metaphor and connecting with him, finding a way to connect with him, has been really hard work. Actually, I have found it very hard and very challenging. But yeah, all of that connects. You just said that there's that shared field, a common communication. Something has worked.
Absolutely.
And it's unique. Yeah. And it almost sounds like it may be, if we extend that metaphor to the intrapsychic, that just as you co-created that, and he's got something but he's not quite sure, that he is creating a common communicative home within himself for those disowned parts, if you like. And so that work will go on. And one of the articles I want to write is the other 147 hours in the week, because weekly therapy, 1 hour, we put so much onto that 1 hour, and particularly, traditionally, some schools of thinking, it's all about the analytic hour, and it's like what that's 100 and I don't know, whatever the maths, 24 by 20, 7 times 24 minus 1. Those are the other hours in the week where the client may be working really hard,
on themselves, and surviving and living and being a mother, or whatever. And I think that we also need to acknowledge that. That's a little raw about being a bit more humble about the role of therapy, and a bit more trusting of the client going on doing the work. And when you talk, Karen, reminds me of clients who come back, who they might turn up 2 years later and say, I'm ready to do that other bit, or whatever.
Yeah, that's been a great learning with that client, and that's what I can see happen. I think, gosh, yeah, here's somebody who I can see doing that. Yeah, it's quite resistant, but it's continuing and will continue as life goes on.
One of the slogans at Metanoia when I trained was defenses are there for protection. So I think that's the same about resistance. Resistance. There's a lovely quote from a person-centered therapist who talks about resistance. The word resistance is a lack of empathy in the therapist. So it's quite challenging, isn't it? Say he's resistant, and I appreciate why that you're saying that and why I'm with you. And even framing it as resistance is kind of, if you like, medicalizing it or problematizing it, potentially pathologizing it, rather than saying, maybe he needs to be resistant because he needs to be resistant.
That is totally right for him to maintain.
And he needs to be resistant because of what's going on in the context of the room. So the
or his life,
or his life,
in
life.
But in terms of the present-centeredness and what's going on between the two, it's about being open to what am I up to here? How come my client is resistant?
And that quote from a guy called Spieria, German person-centered, that was one of those quotes that you read, or where I read it like in my gut. I sort of went boom, like, whoa, that is really, and I would say that, and there's a few bits of other reading, but that I remember that changing my attitude and my way of being with resistance, and almost being more acceptant of it, but also more curious, like like anxious. Rogers has this thing about anxiety. Anxiety is a natural defense mechanism. We shouldn't force the pace. Organisms behave with adience, going forwards towards positively valued experiences, and with avoidance away from negatively valued experiences. So if I'm avoiding a negatively valued experience, and that's cool with me until it becomes more positive or safer that I can go towards it. It's a very non-pathologizing approach at best. Amy, I'm aware you're off soon. Did I get anywhere near to answering your request, or?
Following through your layering was great.
Great.
The diagram works for me so well, and then I get into those boxes underneath and kind of switch off, like, which number and which. So that was really, really useful. And just as you guys are speaking then, I have a curiosity, which I'm not even sure whether it fits here, but I'm going to say it, that you were both originally person-centered and have had this journey that's brought you into TA. And I suppose I'm curious about maybe what's gone on for each of you, because they almost seem, I've got something almost that they almost seem diametrically opposed in a way. And so what was there something not in PC that you were wanting, or it's very much front of my mind and I'm wondering why.
Shall I say something?
Please do,
yeah. Person-centered approach, like any approach, has a wide range of different ways of practicing. And I was always drawn very much to the experiential end. So whereas for me, non-directivity and content was very important, I was always, when I was starting, I was always interested in process and noticing what was going on in process. And when I finished my 2 years training, there wasn't any other training in person-centered, and I was looking for something else. And for me, thinking is very defensive. I I can get lost in my thinking. So TA wouldn't have been a good first modality for me. But I wanted some way of understanding process, and TA has a fantastic load of theory around process, and that's what drew me into it. But I essentially believe I still work in a very person-centered now, thinking about it in a very co-creative way. Yeah, that's what went on for me, and therefore there was a very big clash. I almost felt like punching somebody when they described me as schizoid. So I had some difficulties in my early part of my TA training.
I echo that. My therapist used that word, and I came off and I thought, oh my gosh, I can't be a therapist if I'm schizoid. I mean, I just remember walking around with that for a week thinking, what's that mean about me? Yeah, it was awful.
Yeah, it is. And of course, within the person-centered approach, Rogers quite often, well, many person-centered writers wrote about the problems of labeling people.
Thinking about what if you had hit him, then he probably would have called you something else.
Yeah, probably.
Yeah.
Yes.
My story is a bit, to keep it brief, because I want to, respond, but also discuss other things. My story is slightly different because although I came across the person-centered approach years ago when I was trained as a social worker, and also came across TA, I did my first training was in Gestalt for a year, then TA, and then person-centered, largely self-taught and under supervision. And essentially, it was because I was asked to do some person-centered training at Metanoia on what was then an undergraduate sort of counselling program. And I remember saying that's great, and I obviously showed faith in my ability as an educationalist. But the course that I got and sort of was given wasn't at all person-centered. It was sort of an eclectic mix of this and that, and it offended me intellectually. I'm laughing because it's like, yes, it would, that's kind of. So I thought, no, this isn't good enough. If I'm teaching couples theory, I'm going to read, Rogers who wrote a whole book on couples and this, that. So I did that. That was sort of self-study, and that's when I discovered that there were 6 conditions, not just 3 core conditions. And so I took myself off on a whole sort of course of learning about person-centered approach. And then as I did, there was a lot that I liked about it, particularly around non-directivity, particularly its anti-medical stance, given what we've acknowledged about Burns' medical background and all the sort of slightly diagnostic language, anti-diagnosis. He has some wonderful stuff to say about therapy being the ongoing self-diagnosis of the client, which is just mind-blowing. And I remember writing a paper for one of the conferences in Edinburgh, one of the many TA conferences in Edinburgh, presenting a paper called TA and PCA, okay? ? And actually, I've never published it, but I probably should, because it was very much about that dialogue. And also, I really like Roger's ideas about freedom to learn. And I think, because I have railed against the sort of parental metaphor in TA, particularly in its education. And essentially my criticisms of TA found some resonance, or I found some sort of resolution to them in the person-centered world. And that was the point where I was that's where Graham and I were talking about, well, are we going to stay in TA? And if we are, then we need to do something about it. And co-creative TA was our response to doing something about our critiques. So for me, it's supplementary, and I now feel at home in both. I went through a phase of not feeling a little bit like I wasn't at home in TA, or I sort of couldn't say that I was person-centered when I went to TA conferences, and vice versa. And I remember Kathy Murphy, who probably Alistair will remember, but she was a Kiwi, interestingly enough, although she emigrated to the UK and trained at Metanoia. And I remember seeing her because she was also very person-centered, and her and I having a conversation about being able to be at home in two homes.
Mm.
And that's been really interesting because here I am, dual citizenship, you know, so there's a bit of a theme about, you know, that tussle and whether it's sort of oppositional or whether it's so for me the journey was about accepting the fact that I am a transactional analyst and a person-centered psychologist or therapist. So there's a bit of backstory which hopefully helps you, Amy.
Yes, certainly, and that idea of, you know, this is from where co-creative, you know, where you guys have come from.
So what else is in the room? I'm aware that time is ticking. We've got about just under 20 minutes, and this is perhaps a time, as good a time as any, just to take a moment to reflect and say anything that or put anything in that you would like to put in.
Can I make a comment? I'm thinking about, you know, the history of relationship. It's not all, as it were, today. That, you know, if you've been meeting someone for a while, in whatever context, you're developing a history together. And I think that is an important dimension of empathy, as there's a growing maybe connection or understanding. And what I kind of miss a wee bit, I think, in the co-creative account is that lack of a sense of time, of history. You see, in my way of thinking, James, you and Keith are in my exteropsyche. You've impacted me over a period of time. So I don't want to miss out. You see, I think archaic in your kind of framing is too rigid. It's about way back. Yesterday for me is part of what's archaic. Yesterday is the past, is archaic. So if someone has impacted me in the recent past, that's also part of my exteropsyche. And it informs the way that I relate to that person in terms of a shared understanding and empathy, a connection. But it's not all just now. It has a history.
Yeah. Could I offer you a reframe of that? Yeah.
Well, yeah, you might offer him what you think. I'm not sure if Alice is going to reframe it.
Well, that's fine. Well, that's fine. That's absolutely fine. Because no, I think when we think of the archaeopsych and the exteriopsych in terms of, you know, Keith's model and Graham's model of the integrating adult, I think the exteriopsych and the archaeopsych is what's not been integrated. It's not, ultimately, if you pursue this model to the end degree, and I don't think we'll ever get there, you would see both the archaeopsych and the exteriopsych disappear, and your historical, what you want to value in the history, is within the integrating adult. I don't know whether, Keith, that makes any sense to you, but that's how I think about it, that your history is all there, but it's in your integrating adult. Because the archaeopsych and the exteriopsych is stuff that you have held out of consciousness. It's repressed material.
There's also something about the word archaic. I know what you're saying, Alistair, that the past was just a second ago, but actually archaic, the meaning is a very long time ago, ancient.
Yeah, true.
And so there is, it's not the same. A second ago is not archaic if we're looking at the actual linguistics of it.
Yeah. And yet if something arose a second ago and we had repressed what had arisen, I think I'd have wanted that to be included in the archaic aspect, albeit it's recent. So the word is perhaps not helpful.
I have a slightly different response, which is I think I'm more with you. I'm wanting to understand. It's interesting we're talking about empathy, because in a sense, my response to you, Alice, is, oh, that's interesting that you're missing something about time. And it really lands with me that it's a bit like, well, maybe there is something missing in the co-creative story thus far about a sense of time over time, and those distinctions between, yes, you know, a second ago, and I remember learning this from fellow countrymen, you know, Ian Stewart, with whom I was in supervision for many years, and you know, talking about, you know, that sort of precision about the past being literally the past, even last, you know, this morning or earlier this session, and so on. But I suppose, yeah, what I'm drawn to is almost leaning in and going, well, maybe there is something missing. Maybe we haven't articulated time sufficiently, because so there's something in what you're saying that I want to embrace and go, yeah. So that's where I'm going first, and I think it's a bit like, and maybe it's a bit of a demonstration of this. What we're talking about with empathy is like, what's Alistair saying about time? There's something, maybe I'm trying to, you know, is he trying to say something? He's saying something, I haven't quite got it. Maybe I haven't articulated enough. It's like looking for the grain of truth, looking for the yes, by him, in the in-between. So I'm more, rather than going into, well, this is my definition of the archaeopsyche or the introjective parent, I'm sort of wanting to pick up on, maybe there's more to be said about the time, the sense of time. So that's where I'm going. And I also think there's the difference, this picks up on your point, Rachel, about the languaging, because I think Byrne talked about the archaeopsyche, the neopsyche, and the exteropsyche, but there's some subtle differences between that model and the ego state model. So I think some of what you're saying, James, is true of you're talking more in terms of ego states. And I absolutely agree with you, because, yeah, we've said it, that the introjective parent, for me, the introjective parent is the residue, the metaphor for all that stuff that has been introjected and remains undigested, unintegrated, and the same for the archaic child. But I think that's a little bit different from what you're saying, Alistair, about this time frame, because whereas I can see, yeah, history is in the integrating adult, it may not sound like it is. It's almost like maybe there's more word. You know, it's like the thing about when I pursued the logic of somebody saying, if you take a neo-psychic perspective and an integrating adult perspective, then people are born adult, which was, I think, Landy Gobe said that. And then I took the logic further back and said, so that we're conceived adult. Now, when you start saying things like we're born adult, or even you're conceived adult, the language breaks down. It doesn't make any sense. Intuitively, it's the wrong language. You know, so the metaphor, the original metaphor, starts breaking down. And I think that's part of your point, Rach. It's like we can get precise about language, and I generally am precise about language, but then it's a bit like, well, that doesn't make much sense. It's not as accessible. Saying we are conceived as it were an integrating adult isn't as accessible as a term like, you know, free child. So I think when we challenge theory and we develop theory and we change the language, it's stretching, and sometimes it really works and it works well, and sometimes it doesn't. And I suppose that's what I want you to acknowledge in what you're saying, Alistair. I think you're right. I think there is something more to be said about this.
Just a quick comment, because I actually think, because it was designed to be accessible terminology like parent, adult, and child, but I agree, it is that important bit different from a exteropsyche, neopsyche, archaeopsyche, because actually we're born neopsyche.
Yeah,
that's what it means.
Yes, exactly. Yeah, and if the neo is and maybe this is my slight addition to this, is that it's also the new it's the new psyche, which potentially is constantly updated. Yeah, I agree, but it's the language. And, you know, Rachel and I have this thing about homonymy. I think homonymy is a great word, and Rachel doesn't like it at all. So, you know, she's changing it. And you know, I think that's right. It's a good challenge. You know, that's the point of learning, isn't it? It's like we take something and we chew it over and split the bits out and change things around and find our own language. It's part of that common communicative home thing.
I'm wondering, Alistair, in terms of the history, I think I know, well, I feel something of what you're saying in terms of, I quite like it with working within this co-creative approach. I quite like integrating the different theories about the understanding of the past and where the past has come from. And you know, like Hagel and Sill's development of the self, or the equivalent. And I like that. I like the integration of that, because I like to, that's one of the things that I loved about TA in the first place, understanding my history and how it affected the present. And I don't think there's anything wrong in integrating other things into it.
Yeah, I think for me, there's something about, in terms of the values I hold, in terms of working therapeutically, they're co-creative. But outside of the therapy room, I might think about what's going on in many different ways. And there are many models, many different ways of thinking. And I think that's the richness of this as well. But there is something about what values are important in terms of how I work. And of course, that's open to change as well, I guess. It's not fixed in stone.
Really, because it's silent, can I ask a really practical question as a kind of a newbie? I've only done about 20 placement hours, and I'm just looking at that resistance is a lack of empathy in the therapist. I'm doing half of my clients are bereavement, so in a hospice, and I've had a couple of clients who come having never done counselling, and they feel there's an expectation of what they have to do, you know, and or that I'm going to make them feel better. So they'll say, oh, I expected you to say more. I've had that twice. And I hear constantly, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to say. And I will always return, you don't have to say anything. Just be, and then they'll think of something else to say. What would you say with someone? Is it that is that a resistance that I don't know what to say? Is that a resistance? I know bereavement's slightly different, isn't it? Someone's not coming with a problem, they're just coming with usually a lot of sadness and unresolved grief, especially if you see them quickly after someone's died. I think grief is quite a natural process, and I sometimes wonder whether it's offered too quickly, because I sort of feel you almost need a bit of space to sort of.
It's like trauma, you know, people throwing, there's a trauma and people start sending counsellors in. And I think no, what you need is, you know, hot tea and blankets.
Yeah, a little bit.
Kindness
Yeah.
and, you know, emergency services and so on. The counselling comes much later. So I agree with you. I think maybe I was struck. Well, I was struck. I suppose it's interesting you asked that question. You said, "Oh, there's a silence," and so.
Yes.
And I was thinking that I might hold the silence. I was sort of enjoying the silence and thinking. I was thinking about a Māori proverb about past and present and so on. And I might hold the silence, or what would you said somebody says, "Oh, I don't know what to say." I might say, "Nor do I," or I don't know what there is. I don't, you know, but you have to find different ways. I probably, what you think your response was? You don't have to say anything. I probably wouldn't say that.
Okay.
Because for me it sounds a bit like a permission, that because people may feel that they do have to say something. So I suppose I'm more interested in exploring that sort of cusp between what's in the I don't know what to say and I should say something, and you know, to sort of go, rather than say you don't have to say anything and then they do. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
So I just might be very minimalist.
Or an inquiry. What's that like for you that you don't know?
Yes, or quite lovely. That would be yes. Or you know, yes, what's it like for you? Or it sounds like you're feeling that you need to say something, which is again, that's inviting them to reflect on that rather than it being it's okay to speak or it's not okay to speak.
Thank you.
Does that help?
Yeah, really, really helpful. So helpful.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think sometimes it is about sitting with the silence and sitting with, you know, anxiety, all sorts of, you know, feelings and difficult stuff, and not knowing, but being alongside somebody, you know, and I think that leads us to some more profound things, like, you know, people saying, "Oh, it's safe," you know, like in a group setting. "Oh, it's safe to say blah blah blah. It's safe to share. It's safe to be anxious. It's safe to be whatever." And my thinking is, I don't know if it's safe or not, but I'm interested in exploring whether people feel safe or not in a group. But I can't make it safe. No ground rules in the world can make somebody automatically safe. No amount of
safety will be different to you as it will be to me.
Exactly. Yeah. On which note, we are at the end of this safe divergency. I love that. I'm gonna reflect on that. I don't know, how do you want to end, James? Do you have a particular?
Just to say, I've really enjoyed being here and listening to what you've all brought, and it's been really great. What's come up. Yeah, and I just wonder what reflections you might have as we go and part and go our different ways.
I just wanted to say something that Rachel, I suppose, has brought up quite a bit. I just love the fact that you've said, you know, seeing things as an inquiry, and, you know, what's it like for me, for instance, not to know. It's great because I'm doing my essays at the moment. I'm like, these are great headings. So I really appreciate that. And it's so, reflective. And that's what my assignments or essays are going to be about. They're very reflective. So, and thank you. I just wanted to say thank you for everyone bringing their ingredients into this lovely mix, because it just feels very rich. So thank you.
Yeah, I'd like to say thanks to everyone here. It's been a really lovely morning, and there's something really, for me, the word freeing is coming up, and I think that's because I've been ending in terms of ending training and now starting a new phase as a counsellor, hopefully by the end of the year, and you know what that can look like, and having the freedom to choose what I take and how I start to think about how I'm going to work. And that's been really great for me this morning, just to get a sense of what people are saying about that. What can it look like? What can I take from TA? What can I think about taking from other modalities? And how am I going to work that isn't restricted necessarily, which is how perhaps it maybe feels in training. There's certain things you do have to do and you have to go on that, but there's a freedom that's coming, and this has come at the really right time, I think, for me, just when I've got that feeling of there is a way I can start to think about expressing myself and how I work and what I use. So thanks so much. It's been a great morning.
Thanks, Karen. Go well with your ending.
Thank you.
I think for me, as a fairly newbie within the group, I found it very just interesting to kind of just see the different points of view. I suppose because I'm still kind of learning and finding my feet, it's just good to hear the different perspectives from everyone.
Thanks, Deirdre.
Thank you. I learn. I think who said they learn by. Oh yes, it was Jenny. Jenny, you said you learn by being with people, and I'm realizing I learn like that too. It's so much has kind of really sunk in, and so thank you. It's lovely to feel part of a community. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's been really eye-opening for me, this, and I'm so glad we went through the model layer by layer, and I feel totally engaged with the subject, and so it's part of me dealing with my approach to, what can be academic articles. So I'm really pleased that we had the opportunity to talk about things. And I feel I've got a much better understanding of not just co-creative TA, but of empathy. I mean, I'm really pleased at the depth we went to today, and I have enjoyed it so much and learning from everyone. So thank you, James, and thank you, Keith. It's been absolutely brilliant, and thank you, everyone else. I feel I feel really empowered by what I've learned this morning. Thank you.
You look energized. That's lovely.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jenny.
Likewise, I found talking to the diagram, I think was your phrase, Keith, and that's very, very useful. It's a different way of learning than reading it and trying to fathom it out. So I found that extremely helpful, and I've enjoyed being with everybody this morning. It's a good start to the weekend. So thank you everybody, and thank you Keith and James.
Yeah, thank you, Sandra.
I really have enjoyed it as well, coming from absolutely nowhere on this, and going through your diagram and comparing it with the Sills and Helena's one, can't pronounce her surname, was really fascinating. Has really made me think about, because I've always thought about it, all the PAT model, and on the Sills and Garden side of it. So thinking about it from your perspective with the interpretive adult, I'm now going off on a tangent and thinking about, why do we do the PAT models as separate? Why don't we overlap them? And therefore you're talking to the, I'm going all Bernian now and drawing diagrams in my head. But anyway, I'm going to go away and do that. But the other thing I really wanted to say was how much I got from everyone else's input and hearing from people at different stages of their training and their careers. And for me, that has been really helpful. So thank you very much, and thank you for putting this on. And maybe I'll see you at another one. Thank you.
Yeah, we just did. Thank you.
I just want to quickly thank everybody, but just really comment on James and Keith and how congruent you have been in your facilitation. How you've been with us and encouraged, and we've been able to learn from each other. is really congruent with, you know, the content of what you're talking about.
Mm.
I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
Rose. As ever.
I've enjoyed being part of the group, and we always learn from sharing with one another, don't we? And in particular from Keith and James. I think it is helpful to hear just a bit of your journey and you know, how you come to this way of understanding and approaching empathy. So thanks very much.
Thanks. Great to see you again, Alistair.
Yeah, lovely to see you, Alistair.
Got a lot from moving away from empathy being something that you do to someone, like you are empathetic to them or towards them, and moving away from that kind of, oh, I'm just going to go and do some empathy now in my therapy room. It's you know, it's more in line with how I experience it, even though I don't know how to word it very well, but yeah, it's sort of, it just is, and it's in that connection. With that connection, that sense of empathy grows. Yeah, thank you. Thanks everybody.
Yeah, thank you.
Especially
I like what Yoda says about that. You know Yoda from Star Wars? He says, do or do not. There is no try. So I think it's quite an interesting challenge to the try hard driver, but also, you know, you're empathic or you're not. You know, don't try to be empathic, because that's going to fail. Yeah.
Brilliant. I love that.
So I think, Kathy?
Yeah, I was just going to say, Keith, you were talking earlier about sort of thinking more about empathy and writing something on empathy, and if you do, I think what would be really lovely is to think about the sort of empathy, which is sort of really explored by Damien Milton in terms of the double empathy issue, where it's about you know, neurodivergent people understanding neurotypical people, but also the other way around. So sort of that meeting in the middle of understanding. And you know, just to sort of throw into that, I'm doing as an EdFest in July with Giles Barrow. It's sort of education. I'm doing a workshop with mixture of neurodivergent and neurotypical people. We've got
see you there, Kathy.
Oh right, see you there. Okay, so and we've actually called ourselves Double Empathy. I'm okay, you're okay. You know, from I'm okay as a neurodivergent person, but you're okay as a neurotypical person. And I think that's really, it's a really important issue that needs to be more explored.
Well, it sounds like you'll be writing about it.
I do write. I love writing.
Great.
There you go.
I did a presentation at recently. I was asked to do a keynote speech to the Japanese TA conference, and the theme was broadly about connection. And I getting to this point about we need to focus on the in between, you know, in terms of making connections. I came up with this idea of, you know, because often you see I'm okay, comma, you're okay, or I'm okay, dash, you're okay. And I said, so I might be okay and you may be okay, but how is the comma in between us? Or how is the hyphen in between us? And it's like getting to that bit, which I think is what you're catching us.
It is. It's that bit. It's the hyphen or the comma I'm talking about.
The liminal space.
The liminal space. Yes, I knew you were going to say that.
Right. Yeah, that's what needs to be. Yeah.
Okay, maybe that's the next workshop, James. Liminality and
liminality.
Anyway, I've had a gas.
Giles has already done something about that, so too bad.
Great. Oh well, okay. I like Giles. I like his thinking, so maybe I should join in. But thank you so much. It has been a very rich workshop, and I appreciate what you're saying, Rachel. Been something about the way that people have come in and maybe that gentleness or calmness that you picked up on, HK, you know, quite early on. Yeah, I felt they were quite moved and gentle and a bit tender. You know, it's been lovely. And of course, I'm speaking from the future, so it's going to be a great day. It's been a great day. So, you know, we're talking about time, and yeah, have a good day. Kia pai tō rā. Have a good day. And thank you again, James, for inviting me, because you reached out and said you'd like to do this, and it's been a gas. So
thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank
Well.
you. Bye.
Kathy, what was the thing that you're? Oh no, gone. No worries.
It's gone. I'll go as well, James. We perhaps have if we want to debrief. Maybe bye, Claire.
Bye, Claire. Oops.